Let's take a look at the synchronization of data between a parent and a child component. As you can see here, I have some boilerplate. First, I'm going to show you my HTML file, which just has Babel, React, and then a target div. In addition to that, it references a file called stats.js, and that's where we will do our work. So I'm going to start off here by pasting in a couple of components. You can see here that I have counter and stats. Stats will be the parent, counter will be the child. And eventually we could have many counters, but in this case I'm going to have a single one. So I'm going to start out by creating some state. I will use useState. I will create a variable called stats. And the callback function will be update stats. Next, I'm going to add a function, and this will be the function that the child calls to be able to update the stats. And as you can see there, this is going to be called parent, is going to take in a counter. Then I'm going to update the stats. And update stats will take the counter that has been passed in. Then I'm going to write to the console the value that has just been passed in, and this will be simply to compare the UI from the console. And next I will add my UI syntax. And as you can see here, I have a div that writes out the local value of stats, right? And then I have a number of properties that I will be passing to the counter. I have 3 attributes, make that 4 attributes: the start value, the increment, the interval, and the parent function that I'm going to use to update stats within this component. So once again, from the top, I have created locally some states, and that is being put into stats. I have a function, the callback, which is update stats. Then I define a function that's going to be called by the child, and this is going to take a value called counter. And then I'm going to use that to update the stats within the parent component. I will write that to the console simply to see that versus what I see in the UI. Then in the UI, I will write out the value of stats. And then I'm going to have here an instance of the component counter, which we will write in a minute. And I'm passing in 4 parameters: start, increment, interval, and then the parent function. I'm now going to move to the counter, and I will start off by creating some state. The state here I will call counter and then set counter. And as you can see there, I initialize that state of counter with the variable that I pass in through the props. You can see there property.start, and I'm going to convert that to a number because I'm going to be increasing this number. And so I need it to be a number. Next, I'm going to add a timer, and I will wrap this timer into useEffect, and I'm going to use that to increase the value of this counter automatically at the frequency of the value that I pass in the interval here. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and paste that in. And as you can see here, I'm using useEffect, which will be triggered when the counter changes, as you can see here. Then I schedule, in the first part here, I scheduled a timer to fire and update my counter here in the child component, right? And it's going to increase by the amount that I passed in, which is the increment, which is, again, this one here. And then I'm going to call my parent with the value of the counter. And then I'm going to, the delay to execute this timer will be the interval that we are passing in here. Then I'm going to simply clean that up to not leave any counters out there hanging and potentially have some memory leak. And that's all we will do for that. The only thing that is left is the UI. And the UI will be quite simple. I'm simply going to write out the value of counter, as you can see there. And so now we're ready to run. I'm just going to resize my code in my window and bring in the browser. Okay, so now as you can see here, I have my counter component, and then I have my stats component. And let's go ahead and load that page. That page is here, stats.html. And as you can see there immediately, and I'm going to bring in my console. And you can see there that in the child counter, we have 10. And then in the parent, we have 12. And we're consistently behind. You can see there that we are in the past iteration. Now, my first instinct was to try to do a console log and take a look at the value here of the child after the update has taken place. And so I will enter here the value of counter. And if we reload the page and we take a look at the console, you'll see there that the child is also behind. So the code inside of useEffect is behind, the code in the parent is behind, yet the code in the UI of the child is ahead. And so this is not at all obvious what is taking place. However, what happens is that the timer is creating a closure on the value when it was scheduled. So that is when useEffect runs, the counter value is enclosed, and what you're looking at is the old value. And so, as you might imagine, this is not an easy problem to get around, and most of the solutions don't really apply, because what you need is you need to have a modification inside of useEffect with a timer, so that can trigger once again useEffect in this case. But one workaround that I found reading the React documentation was to use something called useRef. And you can see here that you initialize it with the value counter, and this is a mutable construct that keeps track of that changing value. And we can use that to reference in our code within the timer, as you will see. And so let's go ahead and do that now. We're going to go ahead and simply change counter for countref.current. And then we're going to go ahead and reload our page. And as you can see there, now child is matching the UI. And so let me get rid of this plus here and reload the page just to simply emphasize that in fact it is matching the UI, and you can see there. And so if we wanted to update the parent as well, we could simply use the same here. And if we reload the page, you can see there that everything is in sync now. So this is pretty subtle, and it requires some thinking, and it tests a lot of the understanding of timers, of useEffect, of closures, and how far closures propagates. And so this is one to think through, because I think it illustrates a lot of the ways in which React works and a lot of the ways in which you can escape some of the constructs.